G'day guys, back with the Our Circle, and today, what broke the fans? Warhammer 40,000. Well, first things first, what broke the fans? These videos aren't about people actually being legitimately pissed off, absolutely shitty, the hobbies crushed them, they can't move on with their lives. It's more like, these are the things that disappointed us, ruined our entertainment, that we got out of something. They're the sort of thing that basically just ruined itself for us. It might be something like the Chaos Codex, a famous sort of beating stick. It might be the Tyranids Codex, Orcs. It talks about the factions that were basically let down over time by the company and what the grievances of the player are. It's very cathartic, I think, and it's enjoyable. And the video today was originally going to look at how 7th edition crashed and burned, how 8th edition was the mangled child, deformed and burned, emerging from the wreckage of the game. And instead, the more I looked, the more I realised I had to go deeper to explain how we even got to the point where 7th edition plunged nose first into the ground like a texting driver steering off a cliff. In fact, a texting driver steering off the cliff would pretty much sum up the writing staff nicely at Games Workshop, but hang on, let's not get so accusatory so soon. There's 3 decades to discuss here. Let's start with 1st edition, Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader, released in 1987. The 1st edition of the game, Warhammer 40,000 Rogue Trader, was published in 1987 and was originally created by Rick Priestley. It was based on the contemporary 2nd edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles, and it was basically the science fiction version of the game, and it came after Laserburn. Alongside the Warhammer 40,000 game, Rogue Trader came as a very detailed but very jumbled rulebook, which made it suitable for basically fighting small skirmishes. Much of the composition of your units was determined randomly by rolling dice and then using charts to factor in war gear and certain stat lines. In addition, the supplemental material was continually published in White Dwarf magazine, which provided additional rules for new units and models. Eventually, the White Dwarf provided proper army lists, which could then be used to create larger and more coherent forces than were originally possible with the main rulebook. These articles were from time to time released in expansion booklets, along with the new rules, background materials, and illustrations. A total of 10 of these books were released for Rogue Trader, and these included Chapter Approved, Book of the Astronomicon, Compendium, Warhammer 40,000 Compilation, War Orcs, the 2 Realm of Chaos books, Slaves to Darkness and the Lost and the Damned, Here We Go, Freebooters, the Battle Manual, and the Vehicle Manual. The Battle Manual changed and codified the combat rules and provided updated stats for most of the weapons in the game, and can be seen as a sort of halfway edition which streamlined the jumbled mess which Rogue Trader was, whilst the Vehicle Manual contained a new system for vehicle management on the tabletop which was intended to supersede the very clunky rules given in the base rulebook. Things like you could have a tank lose a crew member, or the crew out of a destroyed tank could survive it and then walk over and recrew a tank which had lost its crew. It was a fucking nightmare. It had an inventive target location system which used acetate crosshairs to simulate weapon hits on the vehicle silhouettes with different armor values for different locations, such as tracks, engine compartment, ammo store, and so on. War Orcs was an introductory manual to the Orcish culture and physiology, however it actually contained no rules, only background material. The Realm of Chaos books were hefty hardback tomes, which included the rules for Chaos in Warhammer 40,000, as well as Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and Warhammer Fantasy Battles 3rd edition. 2nd edition dropped in 1993. It was a sort of effort to streamline 1st edition somewhat. The 2nd edition of Warhammer 40,000 was published in late 1993 and was actually forged by Andy Chambers and his team. The 2nd edition came in a box set that included Space Marines and Orc miniatures. It also included scenery, dice, and the main rules for the first time. An expansion box set titled Dark Millennium was later released, which included rules for psychic powers. Another trait of the game was the attention given to special characters, representing the specific individuals from the background who had access to equipment and abilities beyond those of the others. The earlier edition only had 3 generic hero profiles for each army: the champion, minor hero, and major hero, again taken from Warhammer Fantasy Battles. Second edition provided the basis of multiple game systems, such as Necromunda, and was clearly drawn upon during the creation of 8th edition 40k. Second edition was renowned in my own community for it being a clunky and drawn-out affair, but it was easy to buy into as the miniatures had a high individual points count, and in a 1500 point game, it wasn't uncommon to see just 30 models on any one side of the board. Second edition is one of those 40k editions which seems amazing until you go back and play it, at which point you'll realise that it's Hero Hammer and your units seem to have a pillow fighting fetish, and until a character comes along and with their war gear cards they beat 10 shades of shit out of your whole army single-handedly. Big shoutouts of course go to Bloodthirsters, Assault Cannons and Eldar Wars with a combination of jump packs and vortex grenades, for basically being the ultimate endgame of the edition. The edition was so convoluted and clunky that it led to 3rd edition in 1998. The 3rd edition of the game was released in 1998, and like the 2nd edition, concentrated on streamlining the rules for larger battles, only this time it actually achieved it, if not doing a little too good a job of the streamlining thing. 3rd edition was the point where they actually managed to cement down the fluff, and up until 8th edition, basically it set all the rules of the universe then and there. 2nd edition, things were starting to be cemented in stone. 1st edition is a nightmare, don't go and look at it if you can. There's some neat stuff there, but overall it basically doesn't sync up with any of the continuity moving forward. 3rd edition, this is the true start point of 40k, and whenever we talk about something breaking the fluff, this is the point that it all stems from. If something broke the fluff, it broke the things that were established from 3rd ed. You can't say that something that happened in Rogue Trader, that 3rd ed broke its fluff. No, 3rd ed is the point where everything becomes set in stone. Just wanted to put that in there. 3rd edition rules were notably simpler. The rulebook was available alone, or as a box set with the miniatures of Space Marines and the newly introduced, very spiky Dark Eldar. The system of army codexes continued in this edition, however, upon release, basic rules for all of the factions were actually present within the core rulebook, meaning that until you got a codex which superseded it, you could literally play the entire game with just the rulebook. What a time to be alive. I even did a nostalgia trip episode just on this book. Towards the end of the 3rd edition, 4 new army codexes were introduced. Firstly, the Necrons and the Tau, which had both appeared earlier in some capacity, with Kroot being rolled into a mecha faction aimed at the East Asian market called the Tau, and the Necrons being an initially all-metal, derpy T-800 inspired affair, as in Arnold Schwarzenegger the Terminator, which then morphed into the Necrons we know of today. And, as a side point, many of the original kits from that time period, I believe it was the year 2001 that they came out, they're still in production today, and that includes the Monolith, Destroyers, Heavy Destroyers, Destroyer Lord, Basic Warriors, and Scarabs. The other 2 armies, released at this time, were expansions of both the existing Imperial Agents as Sisters of Battle from the core rulebook, as well as several 2nd edition vintage Forces of the Inquisition. These 2 factions sort of culminated as the Demon Hunters Codex and Codex Witch Hunters. This edition is notable as it wasn't entirely broken. All the factions finished with up-to-date rules, including the vaunted 3.5 Codex, aka the holy grail of codexes. And rather than just jumping straight into 4th edition, Chapter Approved in White Dwarf was used to basically release trial rules which players could then give feedback on to the company, and it basically gave us 90% of what would become 4th edition without ruining everything that had come prior, or a hard transition like 8th edition. Right. 4th edition. The 4th edition of Warhammer 40,000 was released in 2004. This edition did not feature as many major changes as prior editions, because it was a backwards compatible edition, with each army's 3rd edition codex being able to be used thanks to the aforementioned soft release. The 4th edition was released in 3 forms. The first was a standalone hardcover version, with additional information on painting, scenery building, and background information about the Warhammer 40,000 universe. The second was a box set called Battle for Macragge, which included a compact softcover version of the rules, scenery, dice, templates, the normal stuff you're expecting, a starter set, as well as a Space Marine force and a Tyranid force. Notable as being the last time Games Workshop gave a shit about Tyranids, by the way. The third was a limited collector's edition, a new milestone for money-hungry Games Workshop, but it's worth noting that at the time it wasn't egregiously priced for the time. Battle for Macragge was a game in a box, targeted primarily at beginners, and the small softcover rulebooks were a great idea after the lumbering tomes of previous editions. 4th edition was a really solid edition, with the majority of factions being brought in line with the power levels of Demon Hunters, Witch Hunters, and Chaos Space Marines. See, a lot of people like to talk about how overpowered something like Chaos Space Marines was when it was released, forgetting that everything else caught up very quickly. There was only a very brief window where they were absolutely dominant, and even then it was only certain lists. Just gotta stick that in there. It was also the edition which ushered in the USRs, or Universal Special Rules. The concept was this: if you can have a rule for a unit and it's identical to another unit, why don't you give both units the exact same rule? And then list it in the basic rulebook. That way everybody knows what it is without having to get it explained to them every single time. It's a really sound concept, and it's a shame that a certain newer rule set forgot this. Right at the end of 4th edition, however, certain forces within the company were moving in the unhealthy mass monetization direction, and the content was dramatically changing. Chaos Space Marines were the first to feel the wrath of the semi-directionalist writing staff, who were showing the first signs of the attention deficit disorder that plagues them to this day. What do I mean by this inflammatory statement? Well, the depth and quality of writing was inconsistent from this point forwards, with some factions getting no love, such as the Sisters of Battle, some getting too much love, such as the Space Marines, and others like Chaos getting unwanted, unconsensual love. 5th edition, 2008. The 5th edition of Warhammer 40,000 was released on July 12, 2008. While there are some differences between the 4th and 5th editions, the general rule set shared numerous similarities with 4th. Codex books designed prior to the 5th edition were still compatible, with only some minor changes to how those armies actually functioned. The replacement for the previous edition's Battle for Macragge starter set was called the Assault on Black Reach, which featured a now pocket-sized rulebook, containing the full rule set and omitting the background and hobby sections completely, and the starter set was, of course, the Orcs and Space Marines, and it was the last edition that Games Workshop gave a shit about Orcs, by the way. Yeah, there was. I think it's the only place you could still get Orc Death Copters that aren't Finecast or White Metal, if they even sell them anymore. New additions to the rules included more universal special rules and special abilities, such as the ability for infantry models to go to ground when under fire, providing additional protection at the cost of mobility and shooting as they dive for cover. Actual line of sight was needed to fire at enemy models, which meant some of the more ludicrous bases that you'd see in 4th edition, where half an army would be jumping off rocks 2 inches tall on their bases. They suddenly got rebased, almost as if the artistic license became second fiddle to the gameplay. They also introduced the ability to run, whereby units may forgo their shooting to cover more ground. And in addition to this, cover had been changed so that it was now easier for a unit to get a cover save. Damage to vehicles is simplified and significantly reduced, to the point where, come 6th edition, the unkillable nature of eternally stunned and shaken tanks was a major point of contention. The tanks could now ram other vehicles. Some of these rules are modded after rules that exist in 2nd edition, but were removed in 3rd, by the way. Likewise, 5th edition codexes have seen a return of many previously cut units from other editions. These units had largely been brought back, with most of the old rules streamlined for the new edition. 5th edition focused largely on Space Marine forces. No shit, every edition does now, including the Spiritual Liege edition of the Space Marines, aka Codex Ultramarines, in all but name, the Dark Angels and their brutal Deathwing list, the Space Wolves, and the Blood Angels, which between them basically became the cheesiest forces in the edition, until the abolishment of the Demon Hunters in favour of the Grey Knights, which not only sidelines the Sisters of Battle, but completely introduced us to the Drago Wing Death Star and took all the good shit from the sisters, such as assassins and inquisitors. Other notable factions in the time period include the Necrons, which were utterly broken, and the Dark Eldar, which were also utterly broken. Sensing a theme yet? I'll come back to this point later if you didn't. Another major change during 5th was the shift from metal figures to overpriced, almost quality control free resin kits labelled as Finecast by Games Workshop and obviously labelled as Failcast by the community. Failcast has been covered on this channel before, so I won't go into it here. Needless to say, it was a terrible idea. 6th edition, 2012. 6th edition was released on June 23rd, 2012. Changes to this edition include the adoption of an optional psychic power card system similar to that of the game's sister product Warhammer Fantasy Battles, as well as the inclusion of full rules for flying vehicles and monsters, and a major reworking of the manner in which damage is resolved against vehicles, as they were essentially unkillable in 5th edition with glancing hits, leading to endless frustration as the tank you would glance 30 times that game successfully covered an objective counter and meant you couldn't get within 2 inches of it to capture the point. Yes, this is the thing, and yes, Kat, the co-creator on this very channel, did that to me one game, and he won doing it. The jerk. It also included expanded rules for greater interaction with scenery and more dynamic close combat. Not my words, that's quote for quote what they said at the time. In addition to the updating existing rules and adding new ones, 6th edition included several other large changes such as the alliance system, in which players can bring units from other armies to work with their own with varying levels of trust, which was of course poorly thought out and even more poorly implemented, and hurts the balance of the meta to this very day. The choice to take one fortification as part of your force, and warlord traits which allow a commander to gain a categorically randomized trait that can aid their forces in different situations. Personally randomized warlord traits and psychic powers make no sense in either the tabletop or the lore, as your warlord went from being a tactical genius one game to a drooling idiot the next based on random rolls. Seriously, having extra scoring units in one game only to get something like +1 to seize the initiative in your next game? Get fucked. I want consistency, and not one person I ever met has said otherwise. Replacing the Assault on Blackreach box in this edition was the Dark Vengeance box set, which included the Dark Angels and Chaos Space Marines models. It's a very nice box set too. Some of the earlier released box sets of Dark Vengeance contained a limited edition Interrogated Chaplain for the Dark Angels, which I believe was the first model to actually introduce smoke effects. Previously, models had things like fire in their hand, perhaps, or fire on a stick. This is the first time they tried to do something else, like lightning, smoke, whatever. Just thought I'd add that in there. All in all, 6th edition was shaping up to be a great edition, also seeing the introduction of the Horus Heresy game system, right up until the point where they released the 3rd official codex. Because, you see, Chaos and Dark Angels, they were not great codexes per se, but they were really well balanced against one another. And the prevailing thought at the time in the community was, if all the codexes are at this level, this is going to be a really great edition. But then came Tau, Eldar, and Space Marines in quick succession. It's like someone stuck an unwanted finger in your ass, followed by 2 more before you even finished the first scream. Not only were all 3 broken to various levels, leading to a situation where you either had the latest army, or you just lost all your games, but they were followed by the rest of the ass-pounding fist in the form of detachments and formations. We all thought an FAQ was on the horizon when suddenly, 7th edition, 2014. Announced in White Dwarf issue 15, pre-orders for May 17 and release date of May 24th, 2014. This edition came from the blue. Not even 2 years had basically passed. The huge and expensive 6th edition books were still in mint condition for crying out loud, and yet here we were, with perhaps the most unwanted and unnecessary edition ever, a glorified FAQ for 6th. The 7th edition saw several major changes to the game, including a dedicated psychic phase, the way that psychic powers actually worked overall, which was and is still fundamentally fucking shit. Also, changeable mid-game tactical objectives appeared. Tactical objectives will give the players alternate ways to score victory points and thus win games. These objectives would change at different points during the game, and so instead of winning games, you had your balls cut off at key moments due to some ludicrous card draw, changing the game-winning objective from the one you fought your fucking way to all match to something on the other side of the table, because fuck you, that's why. As well as these additions, the 7th edition provided a new way to organise army lists. Players could play as either Battleforged, making a list in the same way as you did in previous editions, or Unbound, which allowed the player to use any models they wanted, disregarding the Force Org chart completely. Bonuses were given to Battleforged armies, not that it fucking mattered, because the increased prominence of formations and detachments had stuck a second fist into your already gaping asshole, and balance was stretched about as wide as you were. Additionally, Lords of War units were now introduced, which are powerful units previously only allowed in large-scale or apocalypse-sized games. Well, they were now included in the standard rulebook, and are a normal part of the Force Org chart, with absolutely no qualifiers like in the Horus Heresy game, which had wisely limited them to taking up no more than 25% of your points, and couldn't be taken at all below 2,000 points. This led to such wonderful things as seeing 1,200-point armies which were lovingly crafted traditional army on one side of the table, and a fucking Warhound Scout Titan on the other, because money is more important to the company than balance. So, to sum it up, with all this in mind, what happened? Where did 40k break? Whilst it's hard to quantify the best and worst of a game 30 years old, the answer is actually really simple. It's 5th edition. It was the best edition. Apart from unkillable tanks, it basically perfected the 3rd edition formula, with characters being strong, but not independently game-winning until maybe Drago. Armies had decent character, with the exception of, well, Chaos Space Marines, and overall the rules were simple, easy to follow. For the most part, it was great. The game would have really benefited more from a tightening up in 6th edition instead of the complete revamp of some of the key mechanics, but it is what it is. The thing that killed 5th edition, and the legacy which haunts us to this very day, was the rampant power creep. Whilst it wasn't a new thing, it was dialed up to incredible levels in 5th edition, with the tournament scene especially coming to be utterly dominated by things like Necrons, Grey Knights, Dark Eldar, and Blood Angels. I knew a Necron player who half boasted and half sincerely stated he could win any tournament with any combination of units chosen at random from the Necrons book. Motherfucker did it too. The power creep made people leave the game in disgust. I remember the player community in my area dropped by half in the roughly 8-month period over which the aforementioned codexes were released. The common trend in these books was a combination of a large vehicle or monstrous creature with abilities far beyond earlier books. Something very expensive and with multiple build options in one kit generally, a trend which started actually in 7th edition Warhammer Fantasy. This will be followed by a series of units which blurred the lines of the Force organization chart with their abilities, usually in the form of infantry which had the firepower of heavy support units, but were scoring troops choices, such as Necron Immortals, or the clearly elite 2-wound paladins which Drago magically made troops. Lastly, dedicated transports started to receive tank levels of firepower and had the speed to operate effectively and still fire all their weapons, such as the Necron Scythe Flyers, or the Dark Eldar Venom transports. I bet plenty of people here can remember being hounded by 50+ Venom cannon shots from 2+ invulnerable save, jinking, shadow-hopping Dark Eldar they could never fucking catch. I remember it. 6th and 7th edition merely continued the trend, starting out promising with the first couple of codexes being balanced against one another greatly, followed by a massive power spike with the next ones. The nail in the coffin which killed everything built up to since 3rd edition was the defunct idea of data slates and formations and detachments and decurions and all that shit. Allowing people to take units outside of the already rickety Force Org chart and then buffing said units or giving them additional bonuses such as free transports, it led to a cascading spiral of failing balance and bloat. The writing staff was so negligent in their duties and did such a poor job in these editions that I'm honestly not surprised that they elected to burn it all to the ground with the release of 8th edition. 8th edition has many flaws, and in fact is the edition I like the least, but that's not the subject of the video. Instead, a brief look at the editions of 40k and how we got to 8th is. The sad truth of it is that the only way to save face for the company was to launch a huge and highly successful marketing campaign designed to convince the gullible consumer that this is a new Games Workshop and not the same company that will literally crash and burn an entire edition just for a few quick bucks in their codexes. Thank goodness that 8th edition doesn't spew codexes of low quality out at a constant rate, devaluing the whole enterprise like previous editions did, which crashed and burned before it. Well, that about sums it up, guys. I tried to make it as sort of quick as I could, tried not to take too many divergent routes, and yeah, the further on you go in it, the more I start to take stabs at the company and especially the writing staff. And it really comes down to the fact that at a certain point in 5th edition, they decided that they could use the rules to sell the models, instead of letting the quality of the models speak for themselves as they had in previous editions. And so, rules were written with that in mind, and that led to the power creep that we all know and love today. And sadly, it's here to stay, because it works. They don't have to sell you models that look cool. They have to sell you models which make you want to win games, because no matter how cruisy a person is, people want to win games. Nobody likes being the guy that loses every game, because losing's not enjoyable, no matter how good a sport you are. So, they sell you power. And people buy power. Anyway, thank you all for watching. I hope I didn't get too much wrong in this. Again, there's a lot of conflicting sources when you make these sort of videos covering such a long period of time. Hopefully anyone who knows better can correct me in the comments below. I'm all for it. And let me know what you thought of the video. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all next time.